Welcome to the Old Republic Podcast.
We are a podcast that discusses Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic, general sci-fi, and about the stories that inspired a galaxy.
Consider this a spoiler warning for everything under the sun and the twin suns in that galaxy far, far away.
This is where the fun begins. All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Old Republic Podcast. Today we are joined by the author, C. Randall Nicholson. Christopher, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah, excited to have you on. So Christopher has just written a book called Crusaders of the Chrono-Crystal, and we think that it would be interesting to our audience because it's going to draw on some inspirations from the Star Wars universe that Cassie and I are keen to talk on. So, Cassio, what do you think? Crusaders of the Chrono-Crystal, getting into that Star Wars storytelling and in a way that I know is near and dear to your heart in the world of authoring. Right? So writing, you're the writer of the podcast. I'm the talker and sometimes mild reader, but
I only try to be a writer, you know. Christopher is a very dedicated writer. And is this your first interview ever?
Yeah, I think so. At least definitely my first interview about like writing the book.
Yeah. And so it'll be kind of fun to talk about. We've talked about books, and then just kind of this is the first time talking about books inspired by Star Wars, and so
yeah, we've done a couple of fan inspired projects, but yeah, I think this is our first actual book that has been inspired by that galaxy far, far away. So yeah, this is going to be interesting, and it's I believe from what you've told me, Cassia, this draws on like the oldest of Star Wars books out there. So yeah, I'm excited to hear what Christopher has to say about this new work and get everyone excited for it.
Yeah. So I guess starting off, Christopher, how did you get into Star Wars?
So back in like 1999 when the Phantom Menace came out, that's when I think that was right when Lego started releasing Star Wars sets to tie into it. They were releasing like stuff for the new movie and also sets from the original trilogy. And so I saw those and like I got the Lego magazine in the catalogs and I saw those sets, and that was the first time I ever heard of Star Wars. And I asked my mom what it was. She's like, it's a movie. It's like, oh, is it a Lego movie? She's like, no. Like she said it like she thought I was so dumb or something. That was the first time I heard of it. And I was like looking at the characters. There was like Chewbacca, and I was like, oh, my cousin's cat is named Chewbacca. What a coincidence! Like that was the first time I knew that Chewbacca was like a character. And then my parents went to see the Phantom Menace. They didn't let me go with them because they thought it might be too scary for me because I was like 5 years old.
Oh yeah.
Or almost 6. But yeah, and they also like rented like the VHS special edition original trilogy stuff, or at least like A New Hope. And so I like saw it with them, but I barely like remembered it or understood it. So I think when I like really got into Star Wars was when I eventually a year or two later did see like the Phantom Menace on video, and I thought it was really cool. So I grew up with like the prequel trilogy coming out, so I have the nostalgia glasses, and I don't have any hate for it. And I thought it was exciting and awesome. I thought Jar Jar Binks was a comic genius, and that got me into it. And then I also had like a friend at school who was into it, and so we would like talk about it. And like I didn't have a lot of friends at school, so I was like pretty close with him, and we were like into it, and we'd like talk on the school bus, and then we'd go to our classes and say like may the force be with you as we left. And then also I was really into reading, and I started like when I found out at the library that they had like Star Wars books that had like stories that weren't from the movies, it like blew my mind. I started checking those out, and I started buying the books, and I used to have a goal to like buy every Star Wars book ever, and obviously that was impossible. And also it was kind of depressing when like Disney made most of them not canon anyway, but it's fine. You can still enjoy them. But and around like fifth grade. It was really weird because like a lot of the kids in my class were like, "Well, Star Wars is stupid. Lord of the Rings is cool, and Star Wars is stupid." And so they kind of like teased me about that, and I got like bullied for other reasons too. And Star Wars was kind of like an escape, just like imagination and escaping into these different worlds. And so I just got more into it. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty cool answer. And then, so your story, remind our listeners what it is called.
Crusaders of the Chrono-Crystal.
Okay.
Yeah. It's supposed to be, the title's supposed to just be kind of evocative of like, it's just kind of like a fun space adventure. So hopefully it gets that across. It's not like too serious.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah. I thought it was a fun, evocative title of other decades, So, um, I guess if you were to tell people what it's about, what would you say it's about?
a couple of space adventurers. They're just like freelancers. Like people just hire them to do stuff. And they get hired to go to this alien planet and find a magic crystal that can transport people through time and space. And they don't believe in its power, but of course it does have power because if it doesn't, there wouldn't be much of a story. But they have to like get it, and then they have to. The bad guys also want it. There's like space pirates and bounty hunters and these other bad guys that want to get the crystal and use it to rewrite history so they can take over the galaxy and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very
Okay.
cool.
Yeah. And then how long did it take you to write?
So it, depending on how you measure, you could count like there were like a couple of other books that I attempted in the years before I started this one. It kind of like just evolved out of like daydreams, and I started trying to write books. So there were a couple other ones that I started and then scrapped, but then those a lot of elements from those made their way into this one, so they weren't wasted. But this one I started like in 2010 in the summer. I wrote like 2 pages and then just kind of gave up on it. I did that a lot. I started like a lot of books and just kind of like lost motivation. It's really intimidating for me. Like when you start with nothing and you're like, I got to write hundreds of pages, and I just kind of ran out of energy. But so that was 2010. Then like over a year later, I was in college. I came home for Christmas break and I found like the 2 pages I'd written on the computer. And then I was feeling like in a really inspired mood at that time because I'd just been playing like a bunch of old sci-fi computer games. And so I felt inspired. And so I just started cranking stuff out again and just kind of worked on it off and on for a while. And then like summer of 2013, I finished like the whole draft. That was like a complete story from start to finish. And then I kept revising it. Every once in a while, I'd go back to it and revise it, make it better. Um, and I always felt like I was always like I'm gonna publish it someday when it's good enough. But there's no point where you can say it's objectively perfect now. So at some point, you just have to like set a deadline and decide it's good enough and put it out. So that's what I did now. But already I'm like, oh, I could have made it better. It's not as good as it could have been. So I actually really like sympathize with George Lucas, like doing his special editions. And like maybe I'll do that in a few years. I'll like make another draft of the book that's better and people get mad. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. I guess what would you say your writing process is, Christopher?
Yeah, so some people like outline the whole story before they start. I don't really do that. I have like a general idea of what the story's about and like where I wanted it to go, but I also like just kind of let it evolve as I write and just kind of like see what happens. So kind of both. Actually, I wrote a lot of parts of it out of order. Like I wrote the ending before I written a lot of other stuff and kind of worked toward that. That actually made it easier to finish because it was like I had like a finish line to go to. And then of course writing stuff out of order um, results in a lot of like continuity errors, so I had to go back and like smooth the whole thing out. But yeah, it's just kind of easier for me to do that than to try to outline everything, or do everything in order. And I just kind of like took inspiration from a lot of places and put on all kinds of like different layers and subplots and stuff. And it's kind of like in danger of becoming too complicated, but for me it was like exciting. Like the more like jam-packed the stuff it is, the more exciting it is to me. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Hmm.
it,
Yeah.
it kind of reminds me of like when they did Raiders of the Lost Ark, they like put in all this stuff they could think of, and then they had trouble with the sequel. They're like, well, we already did everything, and it was harder to brainstorm. But then you just got to be more creative.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Um, it's always good to be aware of what your process is, I think. And how would you say how Star Wars has influenced this story?
Yeah. So on the most like basic level, just Star Wars is like my main entry point into sci-fi. Like I like different sci-fi, but obviously Star Wars is like the biggest one, and the biggest source of like that escapism. But really specifically, um, so there's the Star Wars book. I mean, it's not even really a Star Wars book because it doesn't have the word Star Wars on it, at least in the original publication. So like in 1978, um, Alan Dean Foster wrote a book called Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which is like the first like expanded universe book. And it doesn't even say
Hmm.
Star Wars on it because at that time Star Wars was just the name of the original movie. It wasn't like a whole franchise. I believe on I should have checked, but if I remember right, the cover of the book just says like from the further adventures of Luke Skywalker or something like
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and the cover's a Ralph McQuarrie image. Uh,
yeah,
Oh, I forgot
that,
about that.
that Ralph McQuarrie did. Yeah, Alan Dean Foster wrote the novelization of Star Wars, after the film had come out or kind of in conjunction with the film, and then yeah, wrote this as basically a sequel to it, I believe. So,
yeah. I think it was made so that it could be like a low budget sequel if the movie didn't do that well. Um, and then that's like why a lot of it takes place on like a swamp planet, so they could save money on scenery by just having everything be foggy. Um, but yeah, so basically in that story, Luke and Leia crash land on this planet and go searching for this magic crystal that can amplify people's connection to the Force, make them more powerful. It's called the Kyber crystal, um, but it's spelled like Kaiburr, something like that. Um,
yeah.
yeah, so it was in the summer of 2005 when I was like visiting my grandparents. I went to this used bookstore and got some Star Wars books. I got that one and read it, and it was exciting. And so I don't actually remember like um, consciously, intentionally taking inspiration from that book, but like looking back, I'm like, well, I must have because it's about like a magic crystal. And then it was like around the same time that I started having my own like daydreams and stories about a magic crystal that eventually evolved into this book. So I'm pretty sure that was an inspiration. Um, and then and I've taken inspiration from like other Star Wars movies and stuff. Just little bits and pieces. I take bits and pieces from all over the place. And there's little things like how in my story like they have hyper drives instead of warp drives. Like if I was more of a Trekkie, they'd probably use warp drives. Um, and they use like blasters. Obviously, I don't want to like copy too much from Star Wars because Star Wars is really distinctive. Just like everything with like the Jedi and the Force and stuff. If you copy the like the tone of Star Wars too closely, then people are like, oh, this is a rip off or a parody or something. Um, but there is just like just like the general lightheartedness, I guess, is still there. There were some ways that I like intentionally diverged from the way Star Wars is. Mostly with like trying to make mine more realistic. like in Star Wars, people go to all these different planets and they all have the same atmosphere and the same gravity and everything. And I tried to like,
Not do that?
yeah, I don't mind that in Star Wars, but just for me personally, I was trying to like write a more realistic story and trying to research things and make them scientifically plausible and stuff.
Hmm.
Even like looking at like the way explosions work in space. Like,
How do they work?
well, they just like keep spreading until they like they don't work the same in atmosphere where they like reach a certain limit and fizzle out. They just like keep expanding.
Until
'Cause
there's nothing more to expand.
Yeah, because there's no like air resistance.
Yeah.
Um, and
Interesting.
there's like a little thing in the book where like the main characters have like these martial arts skills and like fast reflexes so they can like dodge people who are shooting at them from a certain distance. And I did that because I didn't want to have to make the bad guys all have lousy aims in order to keep them alive. So I didn't want them to have to like shoot like stormtroopers. And I actually like acknowledge that in the book. Actually, like one of the main characters in the book is like a fan of like it's like set in the future and she's like a fan of old Earth culture. So she's actually like a Star Wars fan. So I can sort of like
Oh, cool.
include Star Wars references in the book. And then it's like, look, I'm not ripping it off. I'm like acknowledging it. It's a homage kind of.
That's pretty fun.
And having them have like more than one type of terrain. But of course I realize that's pretty hard if all planets have like different types of terrain, like diverse terrain, then it's harder to make them distinct from each other. So I can understand like why Star Wars and lots of other sci-fi do that. They just have like desert planet, swamp planet, and so on. But
Interesting. And then what other influence would you say you had?
Indiana Jones, another George Lucas project, that was a big influence on like the general concept of the story because it's like kind of like Indiana Jones in space, where it's like set in the so-called real world, but it's like so it's like kind of realistic, but it's kind of just a pulpy, lighthearted feel, and also like revolves around a magical artifact that isn't supposed to exist because it's the real world, so magic isn't supposed to be a thing, but it is, that sort of thing. Also, like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as one of my favorite book series,
Yeah.
and I think that had a big influence on my writing voice. I actually tried to intentionally copy Douglas Adams' writing voice when I was starting out, and my attempts were kind of awful, but it was a good experience. I think it still left like an influence on the evolution of my actual voice. Um, and then sci-fi movies and books and games, and not just sci-fi, but just different things. Just whenever I would see something that kind of caught my attention, I'd kind of find a way to put it in. Because some people say like poor authors imitate, good authors steal. And so just kind of thinking about the fact that it's impossible to come up with something that's completely original and never been done before. Like even Shakespeare, like even Romeo and Juliet
He
was,
borrowed.
yeah, he borrowed. Um, so I just kind of try to like I'm not plagiarizing, but I'm just taking like inspiration from different things of different works and trying to like put them together and mix them up in a fresh way and hoping that works.
Yeah.
Cool.
Any questions you had, Brian?
No, I think we're covering most of the bases. I really like the idea of coming back to this story here because Splinter of a Mind's Eye is something that I read a super long time ago. So when Cassia, pointed me in the direction of your book coming out, it got me thinking about it again. And I think that it's a really uh, kind of an interesting story. So I'm very excited to read kind of a more modern take on it with some more extra layers of realism and things like that. So just excited for a new science fiction project to sink my teeth into.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
Do you think you're gonna have a sequel?
Yeah,
Yeah.
eventually. Hopefully that one will not take as long to write. I also want to do like an anthology of like short stories that are like prequels that each focus on one of the characters from the book. I might do that first, and hopefully that'll be easier. But
Yeah. I guess if people want to keep track of what you're doing and what you're writing, where can they do so?
yeah, well, I have like an Amazon author page. I've just been publishing everything, just self-publishing everything through Amazon, because I'm too lazy / scared of rejection to like go through traditional publishers and stuff. So anything I publish will just pop up there. I also have a website, ChristopherRandallNicholson.com, and that probably covers it, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely put links to both of those in the show notes as well. So
Yeah. Those are our final thoughts on today's episode. It's a good one. And I guess, does it still work to say, may the force be with you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
I guess, may the force be with you always.
The Old Republic podcast can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, as well as everywhere else that Anchor podcasts are distributed. Subscriptions, reviews, and shares help us out.
And if you want to connect with the podcast on Twitter, we can be found at Old Republic Pod. And if you want to connect with me, I can be found on Instagram at astro_droid_.
You can find us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Old Republic Podcast. Our intro and outro themes were composed by Dennis S. Mowers at DennisSMowersMusic.com.
This episode of the Old Republic Podcast has been brought to you by Nicky Dog from Patreon. May the Force be with you. We will be back soon. Bye for now.